The November rain hammered against the barred windows of the underground poker room like a fist demanding entry. Nicholas Rossi stood in the cigar-hazed shadows, his silhouette motionless, watching. The green felt tables glowed under brass pendant lights. Stacks of cash sat in neat columns, hundreds of thousands, maybe more. Armed men in charcoal suits positioned themselves at every door and corner, their hands never far from the weight at their sides. For 3 weeks, something had been wrong. The quiet maid who moved through his mansion like a ghost, Valentina Harper, the one who cleaned his marble halls without speaking, without being seen, without taking even a coffee break, she had been disappearing. Every night at midnight, she would slip out into the November darkness carrying bags she had not brought in. No one followed her. She was nobody. Maids were invisible in his world. But in his world, invisibility did not excuse absence. In his world, absence meant betrayal. And betrayal meant blood. Nicholas had watched her for 21 nights. 21 nights of her leaving. Tonight, he would have answers. The sound of Marco's voice cut through the cigar smoke, strained and tight. "Gentlemen, I think we can discuss this reasonably." Then chaos. A gunshot that cracked the air like lightning. The sound of a body slamming against the poker table. Chips scattering like snow. The sharp bark of commands. For men in black, not his men, had cornered Marco against the far wall. Marco's hand had moved toward his gun. The first man had fired, not to kill, to intimidate. The bullet had shattered a bottle of vodka 3 inches from Marco's head. But what happened next froze Nicholas mid-breath. The maid burst through the service entrance, her black and white uniform disheveled, her dark hair loose from its bun, and she moved, not like a scared woman, but like a woman who had already decided what she would do. She placed herself directly between Marco and the guns. Between violence and a man she had never met. Between armed strangers and his lieutenant. "Stop," she said. Her voice was not a whisper. It was not trembling. It cut through the smoke like a blade. "Stop right now." One of the men laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. "Get out of the way, girl." She did not move. She did not speak. She just stood there, her small frame blocking Marco completely, her hands open at her sides, her eyes, Nicholas could see them even from the shadows, burning with something that looked like fury but tasted like desperation. In 15 years, Nicholas Rossi had seen many things. He had seen men betray him. He had seen blood spilled on marble floors. He had seen his enemies beg. But he had never seen someone step into violence as if stepping into a fire they needed to burn in. The gunman raised his weapon. Aimed it at her chest. And that was when Nicholas Rossi understood something that would change everything. The maid was not working with rivals. She was something far more dangerous. She was someone who had nothing left to lose. The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. But before the shot could come, Nicholas moved. One hand gesture. One quiet word spoken in a voice deep and solid like an oath. The men lowered their weapons. They did not understand. They never understood. But they obeyed. They always obeyed. Valentina Harper slowly turned. Her eyes searched the shadows. For a moment, their gazes met across the smoke-filled room, across the scattered chips and broken glass, across a distance that suddenly felt like it contained the entire weight of fate. She could not see his face clearly. But she knew someone was there. She knew she was being watched. She did not know that in that moment, watching her with her uniform torn and her hair wild and her small body still blocking Marco like a shield, Nicholas Rossi had already decided to find out exactly what she was doing at midnight. And he had already decided that if she was betraying him, death would not be fast enough. Death would not be merciful. Death would be only the beginning. But what she did not know was that the man in the shadows had already decided something else too, that the woman who would risk everything for a stranger was not someone who could be destroyed. She was someone who could be saved. And saving her would cost him everything he had built. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you do not miss what is coming tomorrow. Now, let us go back to the beginning to understand how a woman with $78 in her pocket and a daughter with 7 days to live walked into the Rossi estate on a cold October afternoon, carrying nothing but desperation and a handwritten list of debts that kept growing with every passing hour. 7 days earlier, Valentina Harper was sitting in St. Mary's Hospital in a plastic chair that squeaked every time she shifted her weight. The chair was blue, or had been blue once, now faded to the color of old sky. Her daughter Emma lay in the hospital bed beside her, so small that the white sheet seemed to swallow her whole. Emma was 7 years old. She had a heart that did not work the way it should. The doctors had explained it using words like septal defect and surgical intervention and $65,000 or she will die. Valentina had written the number on her palm with a pen she found in the waiting room. $65,000. She had stared at the number until it blurred. She had counted the money in her wallet. $78. She had $49 in her checking account. She had $0 in any other place. She had a used car with a check engine light that had been on for 3 months. She had a 1-bedroom apartment in North Philadelphia with windows that did not close properly and a landlord who had not fixed the heat in 2 winters. She had 7 days before Emma's surgery was scheduled. Mama. Emma's voice was small, the voice of a child who had spent too much time in hospitals, who had learned to be quiet so as not to bother the adults. Am I going to die? Valentina took her daughter's hand. The hand was so small it fit entirely in her palm. The fingers were cold. She wanted to lie. Every instinct screamed at her to lie, to say no, baby, you are going to be fine, everything is fine, Mama will fix this. But Valentina had learned a long time ago that lies were a luxury she could not afford. Lies were what her ex-boyfriend Preston had told her. Lies were what had gotten her into half of this mess. No, she said, and this was the truth. You are not going to die. I will not let you. Emma's eyes, so dark they were almost black, so like her own eyes, searched her mother's face. How? That was the question. How? Valentina did not know. She had worked double shifts at 3 different places for the past year. She had cleaned houses for wealthy families in the mainline suburbs. She had waited tables at a diner where the tips were coins and the food she ate came from plates customers had left half-finished. She had done data entry from home at night, hunched over her laptop on the kitchen table, her eyes burning by 2 a.m. And still, she had made barely enough to cover rent and food and the cheaper medication that did not work as well as the good medication Emma needed. She was out of places to work. She was out of money. She was running out of time. Mama will figure it out, she told Emma, and she squeezed her daughter's small hand. Rest now. Your body needs rest. Emma's eyes were already closing. The medicine they had given her made her drowsy. Valentina watched her daughter's breathing slow and deepen, and she felt something break open inside her chest. A feeling like the bottom of the world had fallen away and there was nothing below but endless falling. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text message from an unknown number. An address in Philadelphia, not far from here. A simple message, housekeeper needed. Room and board included. $6,500 per month. 3 weeks, full-time. Start tomorrow. Valentina stared at the message for a long time. $6,500 a month. 28 days times 6,500. That was more than enough. That was more than she had dared to dream. But the address looked familiar. She pulled up a map on her ancient phone. The house was on Rittenhouse Square. The house was in the neighborhood where the richest people in Philadelphia lived. The house was the kind of place where a woman like her did not get hired. She texted back anyway, "What is your name?" "Who referred me?" The response came immediately, "Nicholas Rossi. Your former employer, Margaret Harrington, told me you were reliable." Margaret Harrington. Valentina's hands went cold. Margaret Harrington, the wealthy widow she had cleaned for twice a week for 6 months, until Margaret had suddenly fired her with no explanation. Margaret Harrington, whose beautiful townhouse on Spruce Street had pristine white carpet and paintings that probably cost more than Valentina's entire life. Margaret had been kind at first, then distant, then openly cruel. She had accused Valentina of stealing a piece of jewelry, a small silver bracelet, that Valentina had never even seen. She had called the police. The police had come and searched Valentina's apartment, and in the end, they had found nothing, because there was nothing to find. But the damage was done. Margaret had told everyone, other wealthy families, other employers, the whole network of Philadelphia's elite households. Do not hire this woman. She is a thief. No one had hired her after that. No one except the diner, which paid minimum wage and did not care if you had been accused of a crime. But Margaret had just recommended her for a job. This made no sense. Unless Margaret wanted her to get this job. Unless Margaret had some reason to want Valentina back inside a wealthy household, indebted, trapped, somewhere she could still be punished. Valentina looked at her daughter's sleeping face. The surgery was in 7 days. She texted back, "I will be there tomorrow at 8 a.m. The rain began that evening. It fell in sheets, turning the city grey and liquid, and Valentina drove her old car to the address on Rittenhouse Square, the tires hissing on wet asphalt, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. The house was enormous. It was black brick and white stone, with windows that glowed warm from inside, with a fountain in the front courtyard where water splashed no matter how cold it was outside. This was a house that did not worry about water bills. This was a house where people had never counted money. A man met her at the service entrance. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that probably cost more than everything she owned combined. He had dark hair and eyes that were storm gray and cold. There was a scar running from the corner of his left eye to his cheekbone, pale against his tanned skin. He looked at her the way a general might survey a battlefield, taking in all the details, calculating, assessing. "You are Valentina," he said. His voice was deep and controlled. "Margaret says you are reliable." "I am," Valentina said. He stepped closer. Just close enough that she could smell something expensive, cologne, maybe, or just the scent of money. "My mother is very ill. She needs care. She needs meals. She needs her rooms cleaned. She cannot be left alone for long periods. Do you understand?" "Yes," Valentina said. "The work is simple," he continued. "But it requires loyalty. The people in this house, my family and we value loyalty above all other things. Do you understand that too?" Valentina understood exactly what he meant. Loyalty meant that you did not steal. Loyalty meant that you did not gossip. Loyalty meant that you belonged to this house, and to this man, and to no one else. "I understand," she said. "Good," Nicholas Rossi said. "You start tonight." The marble hallway stretched endlessly, catching light from chandeliers that probably cost more than Valentina Harper's entire childhood. She moved through it like a ghost, like a shadow that refused to leave, her black and white maid's uniform the only color allowed in spaces of such careful beige perfection. 6 months she had worked in the Rossi mansion on Rittenhouse Square, and in those 6 months she had become exactly what Nicholas Rossi demanded on that first night, invisible. Her shift began at 5 in the morning, before the household woke, before the sound of expensive coffee makers and shower water running hot without hesitation. Valentina carried her supplies in a metal bucket, lemon polish, microfiber cloths, a mop that had seen better years. The smell of the polish clung to her hands, to her hair, to the fabric of her uniform. She could never fully wash it out. By the end of her shift, her knuckles were raw, bleeding small crescents where the bristles had worked too hard against marble and granite and tile that demanded perfection. She scrubbed the entrance foyer first, the one with the black and white checkered floor that looked like a chessboard in a game where she would never be a player. Her hands moved in careful circles, muscle memory taking over while her mind counted. She counted money. Always, she counted money. $17 in her checking account. $43 in the envelope hidden beneath the loose floorboard in her apartment. $78 total to her name in this world. Against that number, another number grew larger every day, $65,000. Emma's heart surgery. 7 days left, according to the hospital's final notice, the one that arrived with a red stamp that said urgent across the front. The floorboards echoed with her footsteps, measured, unhurried, the rhythm she had learned to maintain so as not to disturb the household. Somewhere above, in the second-floor bedrooms, the family was still sleeping. The housekeeping staff moved through their own invisible routines in the kitchen, the laundry room, the servants' corridor that Nicholas Rossi had designed specifically so that people like Valentina could move through his home without being seen, like ghosts in a world of marble and money. By noon, her shift at the mansion ended. She changed out of her uniform in the staff room, folded it carefully on the shelf where it belonged, and walked out through the service entrance into the November cold. The city air hit her differently than the conditioned air of the mansion. It was real. It was sharp. It smelled like rain coming, like asphalt, like the world that did not have enough money to pretend. The bus ride across Philadelphia took 42 minutes. She counted the stops, the blocks, the minutes ticking away. Mrs. Chen's apartment was in Northeast, 3 blocks from the hospital where Emma spent most of her days now. The building was narrow, squeezed between a closed laundromat and a bodega with windows covered in yellow notices. Valentina climbed the stairs, there was no elevator, never had been, and knocked 3 times on the door of 4B. Mrs. Chen opened it, her face lined with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been raising another person's child for free, out of nothing but kindness and the memory of friendship. "She has been asking for you," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "All afternoon she has been asking." Emma sat on the worn couch by the window, small even for 6 years old, her skin pale in a way that sunlight did not fix. The medical equipment was there, as it always was now, the pulse oximeter on her tiny left finger, the tubing running to the oxygen tank, the sound of the machine beeping its steady rhythm like a metronome counting down the days. Her daughter wore a grey shirt with a small bird on it, one of the 3 shirts that fit her now, and her eyes lit up when she saw her mother cross the threshold. "Mama," Emma said, her voice thin, strained, like someone speaking through tissue paper. She reached out her arms, and Valentina moved across the room in 3 steps and knelt beside the couch, pressing her face into her daughter's hair, breathing in the smell of the lavender soap Mrs. Chen used, trying to replace the smell of lemon polish that covered her skin. "Hi, baby," Valentina whispered. "Hi, my love." Emma pulled back just enough to look at her mother's face. Children see things that adults have learned to hide, and Emma had learned to see desperation. "When can I run again?" she asked. "Mrs. Chen says after the surgery." "But the surgery costs." "You said it costs." Valentina's chest tightened like a fist closing. She had never lied to Emma, or she had told herself this lie often enough to believe it might be true. But now she had no choice. "Soon, baby. Very soon. The doctors are working on it. You'll run, and you'll play, and you'll be so fast that nobody can catch you." Emma smiled, a fragile thing, like holding water in your open palm. "I will run to you every day," she said. Mrs. Chen excused herself to the kitchen, the only courtesy she could offer Valentina, privacy for grief. Valentina sat with Emma for 3 hours, until the light outside the window began to darken, until the November sun disappeared and the city light started to glow on the horizon. She held her daughter's hand, careful around the foreport in her wrist, and they watched television with the sound low, a cartoon about princesses that Emma had stopped really watching months ago. By 6 o'clock, Valentina had to leave. She had another shift, night work at a cleaning company that paid cash, $9 an hour, no questions asked. She kissed Emma's forehead, breathed in the scent of her daughter one more time, and stood up. "Mama, wait," Emma said. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," Valentina promised. She was 3 blocks from Mrs. Chen's building when she saw him. Preston Mercer stood in the November rain, not bothering with a coat, his jaw dark with 3 days of stubble, his eyes fixed on the building she had just left. He wore an expression that looked like patience, but tasted like threat. When he saw her, he smiled. Valentina's heart stopped. Then it resumed, faster, irregular, as if it too understood the danger. Preston had been her boyfriend once. That was the generous word for what he had been, a man who kept her apartment keys, who decided when she was allowed to see friends, who told her repeatedly that if she ever left him, he would take Emma. He had connections, he said. Police officers who owed him favors. Lawyers who were grateful for the work he sent their way. What could a maid possibly do against a network like that? Who would believe her? The restraining order she had filed had lasted exactly 6 days before a detective she did not recognize had torn it up in front of her, smiling while he did it. Preston says you're causing him problems, the detective had said. He says you're being unreasonable. He just wants to see his daughter. Emma was not his daughter. They had never been married. But the law moved slowly, and Preston had money, and Valentina had nothing. He walked toward her now, the rain darkening his shirt, his hands relaxed at his sides. Valentina, he said, like her name was a greeting, like he had been expecting her. I've been thinking about you. Don't come near me, she said, but her voice shook. I'm not near you, he said. But I know where you live. And I know where she sleeps. For B, 3rd floor. Mrs. Chen keeps the window open on warm nights. Did you know that? Valentina turned and walked, fast, her pace tight and sharp. She did not run. Running would trigger something in him, something predatory. She walked like she had somewhere important to be, like his words were not carving grooves in her spine. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, I know where you work. I know the address on Rittenhouse Square. I know what time you leave. I am patient. I am always patient. She did not need to check the sender's name. She already knew. The apartment was dark when she arrived, empty, the walls thin enough that she could hear the neighbor's television through the plaster. She checked the locks 3 times. Then again. Then a 4th time. She checked the windows, made sure they were locked, closed the curtains, and sat on the edge of the bed. From the pocket of her jacket, she pulled out a piece of lined notebook paper, worn from being folded and unfolded 100 times. It was her debt list, written in her own handwriting, each entry a different creditor, a different desperation. Loan shark on Elm Street, $8,200. Medical clinic, $3,400. Hospital prepayment plan, $12,000. Credit card she had maxed out 2 years ago, $2,800. Emergency room visit Emma had after she fell, $1,600. And at the bottom, circled in red ink so many times the pen had broken through the paper, $65,000. 7 days. The numbers did not change no matter how many times she read them. They never changed. They only grew. Outside, the rain intensified, drops hammering against the window like they were trying to break through, like the sky itself was angry at what was happening on the ground below. Valentina sat in the dark, the debt list in her hands, her daughter's pale face swimming in her memory, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that she had run out of options. She had reached the end of the road she had been walking down for the past 2 years. There was only one direction left to go. The underground poker room smelled like death wrapped in smoke. Cigar smoke so thick you could taste it on your tongue, that acrid bitterness mixing with the metallic tang of fierce sweat and old money. The green felt tables glowed under brass lights, and on each surface lay stacks of $100 bills, chips clicked obsessively by nervous fingers, and the kind of power that only came from being willing to destroy anyone who stood in your way. Marco Castelliano sat at the corner table, $300,000 in front of him, and the sudden understanding that he was about to die. The enforcer from the Castelliano rival family had come through the back entrance with 2 men flanking him like wolves closing in. Their suits were black, their hands were steady, and their guns appeared from shoulder holsters with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. The other players scrambled backward, chairs scraping against marble floors in a cacophony of cowardice. Within seconds, the room had emptied except for Marco and the guns. "You been skimming," the enforcer said. His voice carried the weight of a sentence already carried out. From the Castellano operation. 30,000. You thought nobody would notice. Marco's hands rose slowly. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, struggling for oxygen that would not come. That is not true. I swear on my mother's life, I did not take anything. The gun rose. 2 blocks above, in the mansion's upper corridors, Valentina Harper was finishing her midnight cleaning shift. She had been pushing a vacuum cleaner through the marble hallways for 6 hours, her body moving on muscle memory while her mind counted and recounted the numbers that were destroying her. 12,000 borrowed. Interest compounding. For days left until Emma's surgery. The vacuum's motor hummed a low, monotonous song of desperation. Then she heard it, a sound traveling up through the heating vents, that acoustic pathway that connected the basement to the main floors. A shout. Muffled but unmistakable. Male voices raised in anger. Then the unmistakable crack of a gun being readied, that metallic snick that bodies recognize even when minds do not want to. Valentina's hand froze on the vacuum handle. She should have walked away. She should have left the mansion, collected her $15 in tips from the evening, and gone home to count the hours remaining until she lost everything. She was nobody. A maid. One of the invisible people who moved through rich people's homes like ghosts, present but not seen, existing but not mattering. Instead, she turned off the vacuum. The hidden staircase to the basement was narrow, the walls pressing close on both sides, and her footsteps echoed against the concrete steps. Down, down, down. The air grew colder, and the smell of cigar smoke grew stronger. At the bottom, a single door. Valentina pulled it open. The poker room exploded into awareness of her presence. Every eye turned. The enforcer's gun remained pointed at Marco's chest. Marco's face was the color of wet paper. And in the shadows by the bar, Nicholas Rossi stood with a cigar balanced between 2 fingers, watching the scene unfold with the detached expression of a man observing insects under glass. "Stop," Valentina said. Her voice shook. It barely carried across the room. But something in the word, not the volume but the absoluteness of it, made the enforcer pause. "You want to kill him?" Valentina stepped forward, her maid's uniform stark white against the darkness of the room, a lamb walking into the jaws of wolves. "You want to take his life? Then you go through me first." The enforcer laughed. It was the sound of a man who had never been refused in his life, and the joke of it made his shoulders shake. His men laughed too. It was the kind of laughter that comes before violence, the sound of mercy being executed. Then Nicholas Rossi moved. He did not walk so much as materialize from the shadows, each step deliberate and controlled, the cigar still balanced between his fingers like a scepter of authority. He said nothing. He simply stood beside Valentina, and his presence in that moment was like a blade being drawn from a sheath. The enforcer's laughter died. The gun lowered. In the span of 3 seconds, the entire dynamic of the room shifted from execution to negotiation to surrender. "Leave," Nicholas said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath. The enforcer and his men left without another word. They moved like men who had suddenly understood that they had been standing on the wrong side of a line that could not be uncrossed. Marco stared at Valentina with an expression caught between gratitude and horror. He was already reaching for his jacket, already moving toward escape, when Valentina took his arm. "Your mother," she said softly. "She is upstairs in the east wing. She was waiting for her midnight tea when I came down. Go to her." "You should not have done that," Marco whispered. "Do you understand what you just did? You stood between armed men and—" "Your mother needs you alive," Valentina said. "That is reason enough." She turned and walked back toward the hidden staircase, disappearing into the darkness like she had never been there at all. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Nicholas Rossi stood alone in the poker room, surrounded by stacks of money that suddenly seemed to weigh nothing. He had ruled this empire for 15 years through fear and power and the understanding that every person in his organization served him because the alternative was worse. He had bought loyalty with money. He had coerced it with threats. He had earned it through reputation. He had never seen it given freely, offered up by a woman in a maid's uniform who had nothing and therefore had nothing to gain from the gesture. For the first time in 20 years, something that felt dangerously like hope moved in his chest. But suspicion moved faster. Where did she go every night? Why did she carry bags? Why would a simple maid risk her life for a man she barely knew unless she had ulterior motives? Unless she was working with someone? Unless this whole moment was a performance designed to embed herself deeper into his operation? In his world, trust was a luxury that got people killed. 3 nights later, November rain fell like bullets against the Philadelphia streets. Neon signs reflected off wet pavement in shades of red and amber, and puddles became mirrors that showed the city upside down, inverted, dangerous. Nicholas Rossi followed Valentina through 12 blocks of rain, his black overcoat worth more than a year of her salary absorbing the water without complaint, his footsteps matching hers perfectly, never too close, never visible. She led him to a condemned building on Elm Street. The loan shark's office occupied the 3rd floor, accessible only by a stairwell that smelled like mold and broken promises. Through a grimy window, Nicholas watched Valentina sit across from a man with gold teeth and dead eyes. She pulled out a handwritten list from her pocket. He had seen her looking at that list every night for the past 3 weeks, her face changing with each entry. 40 minutes later, she emerged with another $2,000 in an envelope and an additional $3,000 added to her debt, the interest already compounding, already growing like a cancer that could not be stopped. Nicholas watched her shoulders curve inward, her body shrinking against the rain, and understood that whatever she was doing, it was not betrayal. It was desperation. The next morning, he found Marco in the study. "The maid," Nicholas said without preamble. "What do you know about her?" Marco hesitated. He had learned long ago that his boss's questions were never casual. "Valentina? She is quiet. A good worker. She minds her business. Why are you asking? She saved your life and never asked for anything in return. That is not normal behavior in my experience." Marco's expression shifted into something softer. "My mother. She is 83 years old, and the arthritis in her hands has gotten worse. Every morning, Valentina brings her tea with honey and helps her with her medications. She braids her hair when my mother's hands hurt too much to manage it. I never asked her to do this. She simply does it." Nicholas felt something fracture inside his chest. He excused himself and climbed the main staircase to the 2nd floor, to a hallway he had walked past 10,000 times without ever opening the door at the end. The nursery had not been touched in 20 years. The crib stood in the corner, its white paint yellowed to the color of old bones, and the mattress was covered with a thin layer of dust like a sheet pulled over the face of the dead. Pink wallpaper covered the walls, faded flowers that had once seemed so hopeful now looking like ghosts. A music box sat on a wooden dresser, its metal ballerina frozen mid-twirl, waiting for hands that would never wind it again. Valentina brought his lieutenant's elderly mother tea every morning. She stepped between armed men and death. She did these things not because she was paid, not because she was trying to gain favor, but because she saw human beings who needed help and she simply helped them. Nicholas sat on the edge of the crib and felt the weight of 20 years of grief pressed down on his shoulders like a blade. At 2 in the morning, he found her in the kitchen. She was dressed in her street clothes, preparing to leave, a bag slung across her shoulder that looked heavy with the burden of secrets. "You carry bags every night," Nicholas said. His voice in the quiet kitchen was gentle in a way that made Valentina's breath catch. "Where do you go?" She turned slowly, her face flushing with fear. "I am just running errands, Mr. Rossi. Nothing that affects the household. I promise." He stepped closer, and she did not retreat. "You are not betraying me, are you?" "No, sir. I would never. I swear on my life." He believed her. The certainty moved through him like a physical thing. "Then tell me what you need." Valentina's composure shattered. The words came tumbling out. Emma, 6 years old, congenital heart condition since birth, the valve deteriorating faster than the doctors had predicted. Surgery scheduled in 4 days. $65,000. Repeat the number. Her voice cracked on the repetition. $65,000, and she had $78 to her name. She showed him the handwritten list, each creditor a small death, each debt a step deeper into the darkness. $12,000 borrowed from loan sharks. Interest accumulating daily. 30% compounding. She was walking deeper into hell trying to save her daughter's life. "Why did you not ask for help?" Nicholas asked. "I am nobody," Valentina said, and the words carried the weight of a lifetime of invisibility. "A maid. Why would you help me?" Nicholas looked at her, this woman who was brave enough to step between guns and death, who was willing to borrow from monsters to save her child, who was drowning in darkness but still reached out to help an old woman with her tea, and he saw himself. He saw the man he had been when his daughter was still alive, when the world still held possibility. He saw the man he could have become if he had made different choices, if he had not buried his grief in concrete and power. "Because you stepped between my lieutenant and death when his mother needed him," Nicholas said. "Let me help your daughter." 3 hours later, a call was made. Doctors were contacted. A private surgical suite at Jefferson Medical Center was reserved. $65,000 transferred from an account that had never been questioned, that would never be questioned, that answered to a man whose name could open or close doors in this city with a single word. In the hallway outside the study, Pietro overheard the conversation. He found Marco in the kitchen, watching the dawn break over Philadelphia with the kind of exhaustion that comes from understanding that everything has changed. "What happened?" Pietro asked. Marco turned slowly. "In 15 years of working for the boss, have you ever seen him like this?" Pietro did not need to answer. They both knew. In 15 years, neither had witnessed Nicholas Rossi care about anyone except the ghost of his daughter. Neither had believed him capable of gentleness. Neither had thought that compassion was an emotion that lived in a body made of ice and ambition. But compassion had arrived in the form of a woman in a maid's uniform, and it had cracked something open that was never supposed to crack again. What neither man knew was that Valentina had already been marked for destruction by 2 people who were now working together with a shared purpose: Preston Mercer, whose obsession had twisted into rage, and Margaret Harrington, a wealthy widow whose vendetta had already destroyed Valentina's employment prospects throughout the entire city. They had formed an alliance, and their plan was about to reach a point of no return. The rain outside continued to fall, indifferent to the futures being written in the dark. The charity gala at the Meridian Hotel downtown glowed like a jeweled cage, all crystal chandeliers and champagne and people who had never counted money in their lives. 200 guests in designer clothes moved through marble hallways, their laughter echoing off walls that cost more than Valentina Harper earned in a decade. She stood near the entrance in a borrowed black dress that hung slightly loose on her shoulders, her hair pulled back so tightly it gave her a headache, her hands trembling so hard she had to clasp them together to hide it. Margaret Harrington found her at 7:43 in the evening. The wealthy widow moved through the crowd like a predator, her silver hair styled perfectly, her diamond necklace catching the light with surgical precision. She wore a smile that did not reach her eyes. Behind that smile lived a woman who had spent 3 months methodically destroying Valentina's reputation, who had called every household in Philadelphia with whispered accusations, who had ensured that no family would hire Valentina Harper for any position, no matter how desperate they were for help. "Valentina, darling," Margaret said, her voice like honey poured over broken glass. "I am so glad you came. I wanted to apologize. Publicly. In front of everyone." Valentina's heart seized. An apology. After 3 months of character assassination, Margaret Harrington was offering to repair the damage she had caused. It felt impossible. It felt like salvation. "I have been terribly unfair to you," Margaret continued, placing a hand on Valentina's arm. "Let me introduce you to some people who could help you find better employment. You deserve a fresh start, don't you think?" Valentina nodded, unable to speak. This was exactly what she needed. With her name cleared, she could work again. She could earn enough to supplement what Nicholas had already given her for Emma's surgery. She could build something. She could breathe. They walked deeper into the gala together, Margaret's hand never leaving Valentina's back. The wealthy widow introduced her to 3 different women, each a potential employer, each one polite and interested. For 17 minutes, Valentina allowed herself to believe that her suffering might finally be ending. Then Margaret's phone rang. She excused herself, speaking quietly to someone named Derek. When she returned, her expression had shifted. Concern replaced the smile. "Valentina, I have just received the most disturbing news. A guest just told me that someone matching your description was seen entering a jewelry boutique on Rittenhouse Square yesterday. They believe a diamond bracelet was stolen." The words landed like a blade wrapped in ice. "What? No, Of course, I immediately defended you," Margaret said, her voice rising just slightly, drawing attention from nearby guests. "But I think we should clear this up right now. Security can search your purse. Just to be thorough. Just to prove your innocence." Before Valentina could respond, 2 security guards in black uniforms appeared at her sides. The crowd began to notice. Heads turned. Conversations paused. "I don't have any bracelet," Valentina said, her voice barely a whisper. "I haven't stolen anything." "Then you won't mind if we look," Margaret replied, already gesturing to the guards. One of them took the small black purse from Valentina's trembling hands. He opened it with clinical precision. Wallet. Tissue. A worn prayer card. And then his hand emerged holding a tennis bracelet, diamonds catching the light with cold brilliance, unmistakably expensive, unmistakably proof of theft. The room went silent. Security phones lit up. A police officer who had been working the event detail appeared within minutes. Valentina's protests dissolved into noise that no one heard anymore. She was dangerous now. She was a thief. She was the kind of person who stole from people like them, and that was unforgivable. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer said, and Valentina realized with crushing clarity that this officer had worked for Preston before. She had seen him at the precinct when she had filed a restraining order complaint that went nowhere. She recognized the small smile on his face as he cuffed her wrists. News cameras had somehow arrived at exactly the right moment. Of course they had. Margaret would have called them before approaching Valentina, would have orchestrated every second of this public destruction with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. The headlines would write themselves: "Maid arrested for theft at charity gala. Woman with criminal connection steals from downtown hotel. Police apprehend domestic violence suspect on new charges." In the parking garage, sirens wailed to life. The police car pulled away from the Meridian Hotel with Valentina in the back seat, her face visible through the windows, her humiliation complete and absolute. But Margaret Harrington was not done. At that same moment, Preston Mercer sat in his apartment 3 blocks away, watching the news unfold on his phone. A live feed. Valentina being led away in handcuffs. The text from one of his police friends had been simple: "She is heading downtown. The precinct on Broad Street. She will be processed, booked, held for questioning." It took him 7 minutes to walk to the address his informant had provided. 3 more minutes to confirm the address through the police dispatcher he still had connections with. 10 more minutes to drive to the neighborhood where Valentina's elderly neighbor was watching Emma. The apartment building was dark when he arrived. A single light on in the 3rd-floor window. He stood on the street below and waited. No one could stop him now. The police were occupied. Valentina was locked away. The child was alone. He had not counted on one thing. Valentina sat in holding cell number 4, her back against a concrete wall that wept cold moisture, her hands shaking so violently she could not hold them still. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with a sound like dying insects. Through a small window with metal mesh, November rain pounded against the glass, each drop sounding like an accusation. The floor was grey concrete stained with things she did not want to identify. A metal bench bolted to the wall. A metal toilet. A small sink with no hot water. This was the room where her life had collapsed into its final, irreversible form. She could hear officers laughing in the next room. Preston's friends, all of them. They would not help her. They would wait. They would see what Preston wanted done with her, and they would do it without question, because Preston had always taken care of them, always paid them, always protected them when civilian complaints came through. Valentina's mind spiraled in the darkness. Emma was home alone. Not alone, the neighbor was there, Lucia, who was 72 years old with arthritis in both hands and a heart condition that made stairs impossible. Lucia could not protect Emma. Lucia could barely protect herself. Preston would knock on that door, and Lucia would open it because she was too trusting, too kind, too much a product of an era that had not yet learned the depth of human cruelty. The surgery was in 2 days. $65,000 secured. Emma's life secured. And Valentina was in a holding cell while the woman who had orchestrated this sat in a ballroom sipping champagne, congratulating herself on a plan executed flawlessly. She looked at her hands, rough and calloused from years of scrubbing, from cleaning other people's homes while her own child suffered, from a life that had asked everything of her and given nothing back except the knowledge that she had failed. She had failed Emma. She had failed to protect her. She had failed to build a life where her daughter could simply exist without the constant weight of medical debt and danger. A roach the size of a thumbnail crawled across the concrete floor near her foot, searching for water or food or anything edible in this room of nothing. Rain leaked through a crack in the ceiling, pooling near the metal toilet, the water spreading in rivulets across the uneven floor. Valentina closed her eyes and whispered Emma's name like a prayer, like an incantation, like if she said it enough times the universe might decide to spare her daughter just this once. Her pocket buzzed. The phone they had allowed her to keep, at least temporarily, lit up with a message from Lucia. The words appeared one by one on the screen, each one a small explosion in the darkness. Emma is asking for you. Her lips are turning blue. I called 911. That message stopped Valentina's collapse. The despair did not vanish, but it transformed. Emma was still alive. Still fighting. The ambulance was coming. The child had not given up, which meant Valentina had no right to give up either. She stood, gripping the metal bars of the cell so hard her knuckles turned white, and she screamed for someone to listen. She screamed until her voice broke. She screamed until the officers in the next room stopped laughing. She screamed until someone finally opened the cell and told her to be quiet or face additional charges. What happened next was a cascade of events that moved with the speed of divine intervention. Nicholas Rossi had returned to Philadelphia at 9:15 in the evening. His business in New York had concluded earlier than expected. He walked into the Rossi estate and found Pietro waiting for him in the study, the lieutenant's face grave in a way that meant the universe had shifted. Valentina has been arrested, Pietro said simply. The words seemed to hang in the air without meaning for a moment. Nicholas processed them slowly, like a man waking from a long sleep. Arrested? For what? On what grounds? By whom? The questions formed in his mind but did not reach his mouth, because some part of him already understood that Preston Mercer's hand was visible in this somehow, that the man's obsession had metastasized into something more dangerous. Nicholas made 3 phone calls. The first was to his lawyer, who picked up on the second ring and listened to exactly 12 words before saying, "I will handle it." 1 hour. The second was to a federal contact, someone in the FBI's Philadelphia field office who owed Nicholas a favor from years ago, a man whose daughter Nicholas had helped when she was in trouble, a man who understood that loyalty could run in strange directions. The third was to Marco, who arrived at the estate with 2 other men within minutes, and Nicholas gave him instructions that required no explanation: find Preston Mercer. Find where he is. Do not let him move. The arrest records were erased within 40 minutes. The diamond bracelet serial number, traced backwards through insurance claims, revealed that Margaret Harrington had reported it stolen 6 months ago and collected insurance money. The fraud was documented, dated, irrefutable. The charge against Valentina was not just dropped, It was legally determined to have never existed, expunged from any record, erased as though the arrest had been a nightmare rather than a fact. At 10:51 in the evening, a young officer who was not on Preston's payroll arrived at holding cell number 4 and opened the door. He said nothing except, "You are free to go." Valentina did not ask questions. She moved through the precinct like a ghost, expecting hands to grab her at any moment, expecting this to be another trap. But no one stopped her. No one even looked at her. She walked past the desk sergeant, past the break room where Preston's friend still sat drinking coffee, past the security checkpoint and out into the November night. The rain had stopped. The air was cold and thin and tasted like possibility. Nicholas was waiting outside the hospital at 11:22 in the evening. Jefferson Medical Center's ICU ward was on the 4th floor, and Valentina ran through the corridors with her heart shattering in her chest. Emma had been brought by ambulance. Emma's heart had struggled. Emma's oxygen had dropped so low that the doctors had made the decision to move the surgery to tonight, to not wait another 2 days, to take the risk now rather than lose her child entirely. Valentina found Emma's room and stopped at the window. Her daughter lay in a hospital bed, her small body connected to 7 different monitors, wires and tubes and machines that beeped with mechanical precision. The child was sleeping, her chest rising and falling in careful rhythm, her lips no longer blue but still pale as paper, still fragile as blown glass. Valentina sank into a chair in the waiting room and began to weep. Nicholas appeared beside her, not speaking, just sitting in the adjacent chair in his expensive dark suit, his presence a solid weight in the chaos of the hospital. Minutes passed. The monitors beeped. Nurses moved through the corridor with quiet professionalism. "The surgery is paid for," Nicholas said quietly. $65,000. She goes into surgery in 3 hours. The best cardiac team in Philadelphia is already in the operating rooms. They are preparing now. Valentina could not speak. She could only weep, her body shaking with the release of 3 months of terror, of months of drowning in debt, of a fear so profound it had become the very air she breathed. At 2:17 in the morning, Emma was wheeled into surgery. Nicholas waited in the waiting room while Valentina paced the corridor like a caged animal. She walked the same 50 feet, again and again, her mind spiraling through every worst-case scenario, through every possible way this could still be taken from her, through the impossible mathematics of a mother's terror. Nicholas did not try to comfort her. He simply sat in the waiting room, drinking terrible coffee from a paper cup, his phone silent, his attention completely, absolutely fixed on the door that would eventually open with news. At 5:43 in the morning, the door opened. The surgeon was a woman in her 60s, and before she spoke a single word, she was smiling. The procedure was successful. Your daughter is strong. She is in recovery now. She will be sedated for several hours, but when she wakes, her heart will work the way it is supposed to work. Valentina collapsed into Nicholas's arms, and he held her with the gentleness of a man who had buried his own child and understood that some things in this world were sacred beyond measure. But Nicholas Rossi was not done. While Emma slept in the cardiac ICU ward, while Valentina sat beside her daughter's bed holding her small hand, while the city of Philadelphia began to wake to the sound of morning birds and distant traffic, Nicholas unleashed his full power on the 2 people who had conspired to destroy the woman who had changed everything. At 6:15 in the morning, 12 men in black clothing moved like ghosts through Preston Mercer's apartment building. But Nicholas had not sent them to kill him. Death would be too quick, too easy, too merciful. Instead, Nicholas had spent the night compiling evidence with the precision of a man who had spent 20 years building a criminal empire and knew exactly how to dismantle one. Preston's crimes were documented in meticulous detail, assault charges from 5 previous girlfriends, stalking documented through phone records and security footage, bribing police officers, connection to 3 unsolved domestic violence murders where his friends on the force had made evidence disappear. The FBI arrived at 6:41 in the morning. 20 federal agents, battering ram, body armor, weapons drawn. The door to Preston's apartment came apart like cardboard. He was pulled from his bed, still half asleep, and thrown to the floor hard enough to crack his collarbone. As he was being cuffed, He screamed about his connections, about friends on the force, about people who would come for anyone who hurt him. An FBI agent with a face like carved granite replied simply, "Not anymore." The news announcement came at 8:24 in the morning. Preston Mercer, former Philadelphia resident with alleged police corruption ties, faces 40 years in federal prison on multiple charges including obstruction of justice, conspiracy, felony stalking, and conspiracy to commit assault. Margaret Harrington's downfall unfolded with the same systematic precision. At 7:53 in the morning, IRS agents arrived at her mansion on Rittenhouse Square. At the exact same moment, FBI agents arrived at the headquarters of the charity foundation that her late husband had established. The evidence was overwhelming: embezzlement of $400,000 over 8 years, tax evasion on assets never reported, insurance fraud on the diamond bracelet that had been used to frame Valentina. Margaret, wrapped in a silk robe the color of cream, screamed at the agents, "Do you know who I am?" An agent with 40 years of law enforcement experience replied, "A criminal." She was led out of her mansion in handcuffs, her face visible to the news cameras that had somehow arrived at exactly the right moment, her society friends watching from behind manicured lawns, her reputation dissolving like salt in water. By noon, every major news outlet had run the story. By evening, the narrative had solidified: a wealthy woman and her accomplice, a domestic violence offender with police connections, working together to frame an innocent woman who had somehow come to the attention of powerful people who would not tolerate injustice against her. The details did not say Nicholas Rossi's name. They never would. But everyone in Philadelphia understood, in the way that cities always understand, that someone with extraordinary power had moved in the shadows and reshaped the world according to their own vision of justice. Two people who had lived in separate hells had finally seen themselves reflected in each other's eyes, and the man who had buried his grief in concrete and power had discovered that some debts could only be paid by becoming the instrument of justice that darkness itself feared. The gates opened like the mouth of a beast swallowing the world whole, and 30 black limousines materialized in perfect formation, stretching down the entire Philadelphia block like a prophecy written in steel and chrome. Each vehicle gleamed under the March sun, their windows tinted absolute black, their presence transforming a quiet suburban street into something that belonged in a fever dream. The engines hummed in unison, a deep mechanical purr that vibrated through the marble floors of the Rossi estate, through the walls, through Valentina Harper's chest as she stood frozen in the kitchen holding a porcelain teacup she no longer remembered picking up. 3 days had passed since Emma's surgery. 3 days of Valentina returning to work despite Nicholas's insistence that she rest, despite the fact that her daughter lay recovering in a private hospital suite that cost more than Valentina had earned in her entire life. She had needed to move, to work, to feel useful, anything other than sit with the terrible knowledge that she was no longer drowning alone. Someone had thrown her a rope. Someone powerful. Someone dangerous. Pietro burst through the kitchen door, his polished shoes skidding slightly on the marble. He was a broad man in his mid-40s, his dark suit impeccable, his silver hair slicked back, and his eyes burning with something between excitement and fear. "You need to see this. Now. It is happening." Valentina set down the teacup with trembling hands. The ceramic made a soft sound against the saucer, the only calm thing in a world that had stopped making sense. She followed Pietro through the mansion's grand corridor, past paintings that cost more than her mother's entire house, past mirrors that reflected a woman in a maid's uniform who looked like she was walking toward her own execution. The front windows revealed the impossible. 30 limousines. Perfectly spaced. Each one identical. Each one waiting. On the front steps stood Nicholas Rossi. He wore a suit of midnight black, every thread tailored with precision that spoke of power measured not in dollars but in the absolute certainty that the world bent to accommodate his presence. His dark hair was combed back from his face, and his grey eyes, those impossible storm-colored eyes that seemed to hold lightning trapped behind glass, swept across the assembled crowd with the methodical attention of a general surveying a battlefield. Marco stood to his left, his massive frame tense like a spring ready to release. Pietro moved to Nicholas's right without being asked, taking his place in the formation like a soldier reporting to command. The mansion filled with footsteps. Staff emerged from doorways, drawn by the sound like moths toward flame. Even Marco's elderly mother rolled her wheelchair onto the terrace, her papery hand gripping the armrest, her ancient eyes trying to comprehend what her body already understood. Something of profound importance was happening on her son's behalf. A voice, deep and solid like an oath carved into stone, came through the intercom system that connected to the front gates. "Tell her to come." Valentina's breath caught. Her name had not been spoken aloud, but she knew. She had always known, since the moment Nicholas's men had found her in the rain outside St. Mary's Hospital, since the moment his resources had moved through the city like water finding cracks, since the moment her daughter had stopped coughing blood into pillowcases. She walked. Her legs carried her forward with the strange detachment of someone moving through a dream. The hallway stretched, the stairs descended, the front door opened, and the world split in half. On one side, the quiet domesticity of the mansion, the life she had borrowed like a thief. On the other side, the assembly of 90 men in black suits, standing in 2 perfect lines, their faces blank, their presence absolute. Nicholas descended the front steps with his hand extended. When his fingers touched hers, his skin was warm. Solid. Real. Valentina had half expected him to be made of something else entirely, marble or ice or the compressed weight of his own power, but he was just a man. A man with a scar running from his eye to his cheekbone, a man whose tailored suit probably cost more than a car, a man who had buried his own daughter's nursery upstairs because her ghost haunted him more thoroughly than any spirit ever could. He led her between the 2 lines of men. The formation closed behind them like water swallowing a stone. She could feel every eye on her, could sense the shock moving through the assembly like electricity through wire. In 15 years, none of them had seen him hold a woman's hand. In 15 years, he had barely held hands with his own lieutenants. His voice carried across the assembled crowd, each word measured and precise. This woman stepped between Marco and death when she had no reason to. She could have walked past. She could have called security. She could have buried herself deeper into her own survival. But she did not. She saw a man who needed help, and in that moment, she became the only person in that room who was truly alive. From this day forward, Valentina Harper is under my protection. Anyone who threatens her, threatens me. Anyone who harms her learns what it means to have harmed me. She is family. The men bowed their heads simultaneously. 90 heads. 90 men acknowledging a woman who had scrubbed floors in their boss's mansion while they pretended not to see her. Valentina's hand shook so badly that Nicholas had to tighten his grip to steady her. Why? Her voice came out broken, like a confession whispered in a confessional booth. Why would you do this? They stood alone, separated from the assembly by pure proximity and the wall of collective silence that Nicholas's presence created. He turned to face her fully, and she saw something flicker across his face, something that looked like grief, like recognition, like a man seeing his own daughter's ghost finally take human form. You carried Marco to safety for his mother. You gave him back to her when she thought she would spend the rest of her life alone. I am giving you back your daughter's future. He pressed an envelope into her trembling palm. This covers everything. The surgery, the hospital stay, every specialist consultation, every medication, every imaging study for the next 5 years. Emma will be free. So will you. Valentina's hand shook as she opened the envelope. The check was handwritten in precise script, $200,000. The number was so large that it stopped being a number and became instead a different category of reality entirely, something impossible, something that could not actually exist outside of fever dreams and prayers answered by saints who were not supposed to exist. I cannot accept this. The words came automatically, a script she had learned years ago when survival meant pretending you did not desperately need help. It is too much. I cannot be indebted to you like this. Nicholas's eyes, those storm-colored eyes that had witnessed violence and loss and the kind of power that corrodes the human soul, softened slightly. You already are indebted to me. But not because of this check. You became indebted to me the moment you stepped in front of those guns. You saved someone I love. I saved someone you love. That is the only currency that matters. Debts like that are not paid in money. They are paid in loyalty. They are paid in the simple act of showing up. They are paid in presence. Marco approached, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who had spent years learning how to make his massive frame appear unthreatening. His elderly mother moved beside him, the wheelchair creaking softly against the marble. She was tiny, papery, ancient, her hands gnarled with arthritis, her eyes the same dark brown as her son's, her mouth trembling as she looked at the young woman who had carried her son from the poker room when bullets were flying. "You brought my son home," she said, her voice thin as tissue paper. "You gave him back to me when I thought I would die without ever seeing his face again. How can I ever repay you?" Valentina knelt. Not because she had been asked to, but because something inside her broke open at the sight of this old woman's tears, at the knowledge that Marco had someone who loved him this much, that love like this still existed in a world she had learned to see as entirely composed of violence and survival and the grinding certainty of being invisible. "You already have," Valentina whispered. "Every morning when I brought you tea, you looked at me like I was human. You made conversation like I mattered. You made me feel like I was not a ghost. That is the only repayment I have ever needed." The old woman's hand touched Valentina's cheek, trembling like a bird's wing. "Thank you for seeing my son." The limousines remained in formation for another hour. Staff moved through the mansion in confused silence. The gardeners stopped working and simply watched. Even the house phone, which usually rang with the ordinary demands of a wealthy household, fell completely silent, as if the entire city of Philadelphia had paused to acknowledge that something fundamental had shifted on a quiet street in the Rittenhouse district. When the limousines finally departed, their engines purring in unison like a congregation of satisfied predators, Nicholas walked Valentina back inside. His hand remained on her shoulder, not possessive but rather in the manner of someone steadying another person through deep water. The household staff watched them pass with expressions ranging from shock to understanding. In their eyes, Valentina Harper had been promoted from invisible to untouchable in the span of 30 minutes. 6 months later, the Philadelphia spring had transformed into early summer, and Emma ran through the Rossi estate gardens with a laughter that echoed off marble fountains like the sound of bells. She was 7 years old now, vibrant and wild, her heart beating with the steady rhythm of a child given back her future. The thin scars on her chest, the evidence of the surgery that had saved her life, were already fading, becoming just another story written on the map of her skin. Valentina no longer wore a maid's uniform. Her title was now household manager, and while the formal arrangement felt like a courtesy extended by Nicholas to ease the transition, everyone in the mansion understood the truth: she had become the second most powerful person in the household, a position held not through violence or threat but through the simple alchemy of being genuinely trusted. She and Nicholas sat in the old nursery on a Tuesday afternoon when the light came in through the windows in perfect golden rectangles. This room had been frozen in time for 20 years, pink wallpaper the color of faded roses, a crib that had never held an infant, a music box that had never been wound. Now it was transformed. Together, over the past months, they had painted the walls a soft pale blue and covered them with murals of stars and clouds. Emma's toy scattered the floor in a trail of brightness. A rocking chair sat in the corner, the wood worn smooth by repeated use. Nicholas sat in that chair, and Valentina stood beside him, her hand resting on the curved back. Outside, the city hummed with the sound of summer, traffic, distant sirens, the ordinary noise of a world spinning on its ordinary axis. "Her name was Sophia," Nicholas said. His voice came out broken, each word a stone being laid into a path. "She was 5 years old. She had her mother's eyes and my stubbornness. I was away on business when she got sick. Just a fever, they said. Just a childhood illness. By the time I came home, she was already in the ground. I could not hold her. I could not save her. I was the most powerful man in this city, and I could not save my own daughter." He had never spoken her name aloud before. His men did not know he had a daughter. The city did not know. Even his own staff had learned to ignore the locked nursery on the 3rd floor, had learned not to mention the small silver-framed photograph he kept in his office, a little girl in a white dress, her dark curls caught in sunlight. Valentina knelt beside the rocking chair and took his hand. His palm was calloused, scarred, marked by a life lived in violence. She pressed it against her heart and held it there. "She would be so proud of what you have become," Valentina whispered. "You saved my daughter. You saved me. You took someone invisible and made her matter." Nicholas's grey eyes glistened, and for the first time in 2 decades, he allowed himself to cry. Not a torrent, but the slow, steady tears of a man who had finally admitted that his power had limits, that money could not resurrect the dead, that the only thing that mattered in the end was the presence of another human being who chose to see you completely. "You saved me first," he said. "The night you stepped between those guns, you reminded me what loyalty without price looks like. You reminded me that love exists without contracts or conditions. I had forgotten that. I had buried it with my daughter." They sat together in the transformed nursery as the afternoon light shifted slowly across the walls, and somewhere in the city, in a federal prison where the rain fell the same way it fell everywhere else, Preston Mercer scrubbed floors in the prison laundry, 40 years ahead of him, his violence returned by inmates who understood that abusers deserved nothing but the same terror he had inflicted on others. And Margaret Harrington sat in a minimum security facility, stripped of wealth and status and the society that had once been her entire world. She would spend 40 years there, her diamonds confiscated, her foundation dissolved, her society friends refusing her collect calls. The systematic destruction that Nicholas had orchestrated had been delivered entirely through the legal system, federal charges, public trials, documented evidence, the kind of justice that would follow her name forever. But what mattered was not their destruction. What mattered was Emma running through the gardens, her heart beating strong and true. What mattered was Valentina standing in the kitchen of a mansion that no longer felt like borrowed space, preparing tea for Marco's mother while that old woman told stories about her son's childhood. What mattered was Nicholas finally opening the nursery, finally speaking his daughter's name aloud, finally allowing himself to be human in front of another person. The handwritten debt list, that terrible scroll of numbers that had haunted Valentina's nightmares, now hung framed on her bedroom wall. Every single item was crossed out in red ink. The $65,000 surgery. The loan shark debts. The accumulated medical bills that had felt like the weight of an entire drowned world pressing down on her shoulders. Gone. Erased. Transformed from an impossible burden into a historical artifact of a darkness that no longer existed. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only love can do that. This is the lesson that Valentina learned when she stepped between Marco and death, when she carried a stranger toward safety, when she chose to see another person's humanity in the moment when the world gave her permission to look away. This is what Nicholas Rossi discovered when he finally allowed himself to be seen by someone who asked for nothing except his presence, his truth, and the simple dignity of being recognized as human. If this story moved you, if something inside you recognized itself in Valentina's courage or Nicholas's grief, hit like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear that one moment of courage can rewrite an entire life. Drop a comment telling us what you would have done in her place. Would you have stepped between those guns? Would you have risked everything for a stranger? We create new stories every single day, and your story might be the one we tell tomorrow. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.